All right, in this video we are going to talk about layouts in JavaFX. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the scene graph. And a scene graph, you can just think of that as a diagram that shows the containment relationships among all components in a scene. So when you are laying out a graphical user interface, and in particular a scene, right, we know that from the previous lectures that there is one container that contains all of the other components in the scene, and that's called the root container. So the scene graph might look like this. You have the root container. In this case, the root container is a border pane, which we haven't really talked about yet. In our previous examples, we always used pane. But let's just say in that border pane, then there is a label in there with a message on there, and then a button bar, which is of the class HBox, which is another container that we'll talk about. And actually, button bar would be the variable name in there. It's not specifically called that. All right, and that HBox, as we will see, it just kind of lays out everything in a horizontal row. That's what the H stands for. Inside that HBox, we have 3 buttons. We have 3 buttons laid out horizontally. One presumably says hello, and then goodbye, and then the quit button. All right, so this graph kind of shows you how all of the components are laid out in the scene. Okay. Components that can be in a scene, and hence a scene graph, are called nodes. So that's part of the terminology in JavaFX. And then nodes are child classes of JavaFX.scene.node. So if you have a question about, hey, can I put that in a scene? Well, then what you would do is to look at all the child classes of JavaFX.scene.node. So if you look at JavaFX 11, right here, and then look at node. All right, so all the known child class subclasses: camera, canvas, image view, light base, media view, parent, shape, shape 3D, subscene, swing node. And there's lots more of these as well. If you can drill down and see all of the child nodes of those. All right, so if it's a child class of node or some descendant of that node, then you can put it in a scene. Certain nodes can act as containers. Those nodes that can act as containers of other nodes are called child classes of parent, or descendants of the parent class. So you can see that parent class right here, and if you drill down to here, you'll see a lot more of those as well. Okay, let's see, go up. There's pane, and then here are some of the other layouts that we'll talk about in this lecture. All right, the nodes that are contained in a container are called the children of that node, and that's sort of what this scene graph represents. All right, let's take a look at the scene graph implementation example. All right, and this goes back to this scene graph here that we had, right? So we had a root container that was a border pane, and so we can see that here. Inside that border pane, there was a label called message. All right, so there's the label, and let's see where. Here we haven't talked about border pane yet, but here is where I add that label into the border pane. Here is where I add the HBox into that border pane. So here, over here, we have a variable button bar, and the class of that is an HBox. So here you can see where I created that HBox, and then here's where I added into there. Okay. Then we have 3 buttons inside the HBox. So here's where I create those 3 buttons. And here's where I add those buttons into the HBox. And so when I run this, this is what it looks like. Okay, so here in the middle I get a message. I get these 3 buttons down here: hello, goodbye, and quit. Okay, so this is a realization, right, of that scene graph. Okay, so these scene graphs kind of help you can think about how your components are laid out in the GUI. So it's helpful to think in those terms. All right, and don't worry too much if you don't know about the specifics. We're going to talk about each one of these in detail, the HBox and the border pane as well. All right, so next up we're going to talk about layouts. A layout is a positioning of the GUI components in a scene. And in order for JavaFX to do a layout, right, the positions and sizes of each component in that layout have to be determined. All right, so those are the 2 things. So when you have a scene and you have it laid out and you run it, JavaFX is going to calculate positions and sizes for each of those components. So some of the things you do in the code will have, effects on the positions and sizes of each component. All right, so that's basically what JavaFX has to do. You have to determine positions and sizes of those components. All right, and so when you choose a layout, right, like a border pane or a pane or something else, right, the layout of the child nodes that are in that, right, so like in the previous example, we had a border pane, right, with some buttons in it and things like that. The layout is usually done automatically by the container. Okay, so in that case, like say your root component is a border pane, it will normally determine all the positions and sizes of all of the things that are inside that container. Though different containers, right, have different ways for laying out their child nodes, and we'll see the effect on each of those things. So when you're laying out a scene, right, you're going to have to decide, what you think is the best way to do it. And it just depends on the application. There's no one container that you might say is the easiest or the best one to use. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Every node that you put in a container has 3 sets of widths and heights associated with it. It has a minimum width and height, a maximum width and height, and a preferred width and height. Okay, and so a container, when it's determining the position and size of the nodes, the children, however you want to say it, that are in the container, it usually goes to each one of those nodes and tries to look at these values and get everything set up correctly. Okay, so the containers will consult these values, the minimum width and height, max width and height, and preferred width and height of the components that you put into the scene. So like a button, a label, or text field are the ones that we've talked about so far. So once a container consults all of the nodes about their preferred widths and heights and everything else, then the container is going to compute its own preferred size based on those nodes that are inside it. So it basically checks each child node to try and have at least its preferred size in there. And then once it determines that, then it will lay itself out accordingly. So some nodes are resizable. So some things like buttons or text fields or labels are resizable. And there are some methods that you can use to change their preferred minimum and maximum sizes. Okay, we've already seen a little bit of how to do that in the introduction section. Okay, so the containers, we already talked about. Containers are nodes that can contain other nodes, and those are descendants of the parent class. The containers that do layouts are child classes of JavaFX.scene.layout.pane. Okay, and so here you can see right here's JavaFX.scene.layout.pane, right, and here are the child classes: anchor pane, border pane, dialog pane, flow pane, grid pane, HBox, and this one I'm not familiar with: stack pane, text flow, tile pane, and VBox. So we'll go over quite a few of these. The one I didn't include here that I probably should include is anchor pane. That one is pretty useful. That will anchor a control like a button or text field or something similar label to sort of the outside edge. So you can anchor it to the top of the window or the side of the window. So that's useful sometimes. All right, first off, let's talk about pane. And we've already talked about pane before, right, in the previous example. That's the only one layout that we used in the previous examples in the introduction. In those videos, we saw where we had getChildren.add or .addAll to actually add components to the pane. Then in those introductions, we also used the relocate method. And that allows you to position a node by specifying its X and Y coordinates. So you can move the node around and have pretty decent control over where the node is positioned. Although if you have a lot of nodes, that might be somewhat of a pain to have to do and set that all manually. So sometimes you wouldn't want to do that. To control the size of a node in your scene, then you're going to use the resize method. You can set the width and height of a resizable node. However, before resize method will actually have an effect, then you have to set the node to set managed. Okay, so let's take a look at this pane demo and you can see how this is. All right, so once again, this setup for this particular application is exactly the same as in the previous examples. I mean, it is exactly the same. We have this start method, right? Inside the start method, we create our root component. We create some buttons. We position them and try to resize some of them. And then we add them into the pane exactly the same way we did before. That's root.getChildren.addAll, and then we we add those into the root component. And then we create a scene using that root component. We set the scene right in the stage, and then we show the stage. Okay, and so let's take a look at what happens when we run it. All right, so here you can see the effects on some of the relocate. Here is the button, all right, at 1010, 10250. It's down here, 110, relocates it to here. You can see I'm getting a default size, right, for these buttons. That's probably the preferred width and height of the button. And so let's say I want a little bit bigger button, right, for B3. I do B3 resize 150/75, right, and you can see that it has no effect at all. That's because the button B3 is in managed mode. And so what you need to do is to do this, set managed. So for button B4, I call the set managed method with false as the argument, and then I resize it, and you can see now that it has resized the button. So before that resize will take effect on some nodes, you will have to set this managed to false. All right, and so that's it. There's not a whole lot more to this example than what was in the intro videos. All right, next up is the border pane. So the border pane lays out its children in a top, left, right, bottom, and center positions. All right, so you can see where the positions are located in the window. And the thing about border pane at first that seems weird is that you can only put one component in the top, one in the right, one in the center, one in the left, and one in the bottom. Okay, and so that's true. And you may think, well, that's not very useful. But the thing is that what you can do is put a container as the component in each one of these cells, and then you can put a lot more components in that container itself. Okay, so you're really not limited, right? You can add as many as you want to. You just have to put another container in that compartment first, and then add the nodes to that container. Okay. When you want to add the children to the border pane compartments, what you would do is there are these 5 methods: set top, set bottom, set left, set right, and set center. All right, and whatever component you put in there, it will add that to the top, bottom, left, right, or center compartment in there. Then if you want to remove a node from one of those compartments, then you would call that same method like set top or set bottom, but then use null as the argument, and that will remove the child node from out of there. All right. In the those compartments within the border pane, you can set the alignment, right, of the node inside there. So and how you would do that is with this static method inside border pane called set alignment. So it's static, so you would just put the class name border pane and then set alignment, and then the particular child that's in there that you want to adjust the alignment of, and then the position in which you want to set. So the positions are any value of this class JavaFX.geometry.pos. Now let's take a look at that. All right, so here are the options that you can use: baseline center, baseline left, baseline right, bottom center, bottom left, bottom right, center, center left, center right, top center, and top left and top right. And all of those are pretty self-explanatory. Okay. All right, and let's take a look at the border pane demo to take a look at an example of how you would use that. Okay, in the border pane demo, you can see I have import javafx.geometry.pos, so I can set the alignments of the child nodes of the compartments of the border pane. You would have to import javafx.scene.layout.borderpane. Everything else is pretty standard here, like the previous examples that we've done. Your class is going to extend application. You've got to implement the start method. You have to create a root component. And so now this is the first example where we're not using a pane, right, as the component, as the root component, right? We're using a border pane. So I create some buttons in there. I create 5 buttons, and then I'm going to add those buttons to the border pane. Okay, so how I would do that, again, this is going to be different than it is for a pane. Right, you do set top, set bottom, set left, set right, set center on the root component here. Okay, so that adds the buttons into the various compartments of the border pane. And then here I start setting the alignments on here, and here are the defaults. Okay, and so let's run this and so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so 0 is this button is in the top, the bottom is 1 in the bottom compartment, the left is 2, in the right compartment is 3, and in the center compartment is 4 here. Okay. So what I've done is I've messed with the alignments here. So For the button 0 in the top compartment, I made it at the center, right? At the bottom border pane, I made it at the, or for the bottom of the border pane 1, I made it bottom center, so you can see it's flush with the bottom of the window there. For B2, which is over here on the left, right, I made it down at the bottom right. For B3, I made it center right, so you can see it's over here in the right compartment. It's in the center, all the way to the right. And then B4 is in the top left of the center, right? So it's up here. And over here you can see the defaults. What I'm going to do is comment these out, and you'll be able to see the defaults when I compile it and rerun it. So there are the defaults, right? For the top, it's top left, so that's why 0 is over here. For the bottom, it's bottom left, so that's why 1 is pushed all the way over here. For the right, or left rather, it's top left. For the right, it's top right, so 3 is all the way up here now. And then for the center, as it should be, it's the center, okay? So those alignments will affect, you know, where your things are located in this, in the various compartments, okay? All right, you can see when I resize the border pane, one nice thing is, unless I make it too small, right, all those components are kind of there and kind of get moved around and shifted to the natural positions. Whereas with pane, right, it's not going to do that. If you go past where you located the node, it's going to go right off the screen, right? So if I do this with a pane, those buttons would have disappeared. The 3 and the 1 and the 4, they would have gone. But you can see when I resize this one, it kind of moves everything and scales everything. So you really don't want those components to disappear, unless, you know, I mean, unless you go to ridiculous lengths. There's really nothing you can do about that. Okay, so you can see already border pane does some things that are a little bit nicer than pane. Everything else in this application is exactly the same, right? I create my root component, I put my components in there, create a scene object, set the scene, right? And then show the stage. All right, next up is the HBox, and HBox is a very, very simple layout. It lays out its nodes in a horizontal row. That's it. Okay. You can use the set spacing method to increase the spacing between the nodes, and adding into an HBox is it's exactly the same as adding into a pane with getChildren.add or getChildren.addAll to add a bunch of nodes at the same time. So one of the nice things is to use HBox in conjunction with a border pane, right? If you want a bunch of buttons across the bottom or the top of your border pane, then you could put an HBox in there and put a bunch of buttons in there laid out horizontally. VBox, also very much the same. It lays out its nodes in a vertical column. So almost exactly the same as HBox, except it's vertical instead of horizontal. So let's take a look at HBox. You can see here HBox. I've got the import for the HBox up here. And I have some extra things in here. I'm not totally certain if I use those. It doesn't look like it. All right, let's just run this. Here you can see that the root container is an HBox, although, you know, there's not too often when you would do that, but I just wanted to try and keep it as simple as possible. And then I created 4 buttons, and you can see that they are laid out in a horizontal row, right? And that's what it does. So nothing too exciting about this one. Let's increase the spacing a little bit. Let's go to 40. And you can see now the buttons are spaced out a little bit more. Okay. And for VBox, very similar. And here's the VBox. You can see it's almost exactly the same, right? The buttons are just now laid out in a vertical fashion instead of a horizontal fashion. All right. All right, next up is grid pane. And grid pane uses a grid, right, to lay out its child nodes in rows and columns, okay? So you can see the rows go across, right? They start at 0 and the columns go up and down as they should, right? And they also start at column 0. When you go to add nodes to a grid pane, then you're going to have to tell it what child, right, you want to add, and then what column, and then what row, okay? So that's the basic thing. You're going to have to tell it, column 0, row 2, and whatever child you want to add in there. Then if you want your child node to span multiple columns and spans and rows, then you would also give it these other two numbers here, ints, and tell it how many columns that you wanted to span or how many rows that you want to span. Although it is sometimes a little bit strange how it lays those things out. And sometimes it seems like if you don't have anything in a row or a column, it will collapse that column. So let's take a look at grid pane. Okay, so let's run it first, and you can take a look at it. All right, so here's the example. I've got a bunch of buttons that I laid out in here. All right, you can see I have this one massive button right here. I did that to illustrate how you could make a control span multiple rows and multiple columns. So, all right, let's take a look at the mechanics of this here. So the import would be for grid pane. And then here I'm making my root component a grid pane. All right, I set the alignment for center, right, on this. So everything's laid out in the center of the grid pane. And then here, you can set the gaps between the components. I also set the grid lines visible. You can turn that off or turn that on. Here I turned on the grid lines because trying to show you, how these things are located in rows and columns is just a lot easier if those grid lines are on there. So you could turn this off. And it would look like this, right? So you don't have to have those things in there, okay? But like I said, it's just easier to explain it. These gaps also, right, I'm just going to increase, say, the horizontal gap to 20, and so you can see the effect of that. It's a lot easier to see the effect of it with with these things. So now you can see that these gaps, right, the horizontal gaps are bigger, right? So here's a horizontal gap, and here the vertical gap, right, is 10, whereas the horizontal gap between the rows and the columns is double that. Okay. Let's set it back. Looks weird that way. All right, so we've seen that we can control the spacing between the rows and columns with this and how to turn the grid lines on and off. Then here I create all of these buttons that I want to add in there. All right, and then how do I add those buttons in there? You add the buttons in there, right, by telling it what child, right, that you want to, child node you want to add in there. So it's the root, the grid pane, right, is called root in this It's the root component. And then, so you tell it to add this child B0 at this row and this column. So that's this button right up here. And add the child B1 to the root component at row 1, column 1. So you can see that's where that's at. All right, so you could use this to position a bunch of things out. So this, and that's just what I've done here. This last one, 10, right, is an example to show you how to position it where it spans multiple rows and multiple columns. So, so here what I did was I wanted to add the child B10, which is this button, right? I said position it at row 5, column 1, right? So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, right? So here's where it normally would have been, right? In this little compartment right here. But then I said, hey, I want that button to span 3 rows, right? Or I guess it's column. Is it column span, row span? It looks like, which is backwards, but so 3 columns, right? And then 4 rows. So you can see that's the size of the button, increased it. Now that is a little flaky if I delete some of these components, or just fail to add, not delete them, but just I don't add them in and run it. You can see, right, I don't really get that desired effect that I wanted. Right, you can see it doesn't really make, I guess it does, potentially. Nah, it doesn't really do that at all. It doesn't have the same effect, right? You kind of think it would, but it doesn't. So if there's nothing in that row or column, it kind of collapses the row or column. So that is, to me, a little bit annoying. I'm sure you could probably change it to have something else in there like that. But potentially, I guess this is probably most useful if you have every row, every column filled with stuff in there. It's probably more predictable when you're laying that out. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. All right, let's add those back in and show you one more thing that you have to be careful of. So let's see this thing. If I comment out this set max size on this button and run it again, this is what I get. Okay, you can see that that this span, column span and row span had really no effect, or not the intended effect that I wanted to. The reason, right, for that is because, remember what I said was that about child nodes is that they all have 3 sets of heights, right? A min, width and height, a preferred width and height, and a max width and height. And so resizing this node here, it would have caused it to go beyond its max width and height. All right, and so sometimes that's annoying. You'll think, hey, why is that not working? Because it's not expanding out. That's because its max width and height would have been exceeded, right? So what I do in this line right here, line 50, is I increase the max size of the button, okay? And this double max value, that's just the largest double that's that the computer is capable of representing. So this is the largest possible value. And so you can see now if I set the max width and height to the largest possible value, then the button actually does get resized. Because now this does now not violate its max width and height. It's not, before we were basically asking it to increase its size beyond what it said its max width and height were, and it just didn't do it. So now we increase the max width and height here, and so now it is able to expand to span 3 columns and 4 rows. Okay, So that's another little tricky thing that happens sometimes when you're trying to resize these buttons. Other than that, again, everything else is the same, right? We create a scene with that root component with the grid pane, set the scene, right, and show the stage. So that part is the same. All right, next up is tile pane. And tile pane lays out its children in a grid of uniformly sized tiles. So it's really convenient if you have a lot of tiles to lay out. All right, so there are the tiles. In this one, I created a little loop, right, to lay out all the tiles there, and I'll show you that in a second. But you can see, right, this thing will, as I resize it, it will adjust it, right, squeeze those tiles in. So it's pretty nice. Here I had 50 buttons that I added in, and I didn't really have, you'll see I didn't really have to do much to add those in and get this effect here. So looking at it, this is tile pane, so you'd have to issue the import javafx.scene.layout.tilepane. So I made a tile pane as the root component. This set H gap and set V cap is exactly like the grid pane. It maintains the gap between the components. And this, I just created a little for loop to create the 50 buttons, right? And then to add a button into the tile pane, it's exactly the same as it is with pane, right? It's getChildren.add, and then here I created the button inside here. Okay, and then everything else is the same. So you can see, you know, I have a lot of buttons here for not a lot of code, and it's pretty flexible. It's pretty nicely laid out. The main thing with tile pane, right, is that all of its children get laid out in uniformly sized tiles. All the tiles are exactly the same size. The next one that we'll look at is flow pane, right? Flow pane will also lay out its child nodes in a grid of tiles, but the size of the tiles doesn't have to be the same. Okay, so tile pane forces all the tiles to have the same size. Flow pane does not. And so to illustrate that difference, I do the same thing in flow pane as I did with tile pane. Here the root component is flow pane, right? And don't forget to import up here. Everything is the same. The only thing I do is I change the size of the buttons here. So here I'm setting the preferred size of the button to something other than what the default is. That's really the only difference. And when you do that, you can see that the buttons I make early on are pretty small, right? And they start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so you can see these buttons are huge. So that's the difference between flow pane and tile pane. All right, is that here you can have different size objects in here. To really see the difference though, if I take this and I copy this code and put it into tile pane, so here, try to go make a bunch of different size buttons in tile pane, then you'll see the difference. So the tiles, right, in here have to be the same. So you can see there's a lot more space, right, around these little tiny buttons that I made than there is around the big buttons. That's because what it did, right, was found the size of the biggest button, which is this last one right here, and it made the tile, right, for this one, so this button could fit in, and it made all the other tiles exactly the same thing in here. So the area around it is the same for all of these. So that's why you can see there's so much space around these little buttons, and really there's not much space at all around these big buttons. Whereas with flow pane, you can see, if we do this quickly enough, right, with flow pane, the same thing will give you, there's not a whole big bunch of space around this button, around the little buttons, right? Flow pane doesn't mind having a tile here that's much smaller than the tile over here. Okay, so that's the main difference between those two. All right, so those are the layouts that we are going to talk about. There's one more that I probably should have done, and that's anchor pane, and that one is really pretty useful for some things. But this is good enough for now to get started with, and then probably later on I'll add the anchor pane. I'll use it in an example somewhere to show its use as well. All right, so that's it for this video. We will do an example of laying something out in the next video.